Alright, so in this video, I'm going to show you how to set up Passport.js with JSON Web Token. So we're going to build out an authentication endpoint where we can log in. And when we send our username and password, the server is going to send us back a JSON Web Token. And then we're going to grab that JSON Web Token and send it on future requests. And so that way we can actually access certain endpoints. And then we can build out an endpoint where it sends us back our own data. And you'll see how everything is going to work only when we have a valid JSON Web Token. So I'll show you an example where we use a mock user. So I have a simple Nest.js project set up right now. It has absolutely nothing. So let's just set up our auth module. So I'm going to use the Nest CLI tool to scaffold my module. So I'm going to type nest g for generate, and then you can type module and then auth like this. And if for whatever reason the CLI tool is giving you issues, you can always just manually create the module by creating the folder, and then inside the folder just create the module like this. But by generating it using the CLI tool, it not only creates the class and adds the module annotation for us, but it also imports it right over here, and it does it all automatically for us. So right now I have my auth module. I need a controller class, so I'm going to type nest g controller, and I'm going to name it auth. And what this will do is it will look for that auth module right over here, and you can see that it generates the controller file and the class inside the controller file inside the auth folder, and it registers it with the auth module. And I'm going to do the same thing for the service. So nest g service auth, and it's going to generate the auth service inside the auth folder. And then it registers it right over here in the providers. So we don't have to manually type this all out ourselves. The Nest CLI tool does it for us. Now it does generate these spec files. We're going to ignore them for now, so don't worry about it. You can delete it if you want to. We're only going to focus on the auth controller, the auth service.ts, and our auth module.ts. So let's just run our application real quick, make sure everything works. So let's type npm run start :dev, and everything should work fine. Okay, you can see right now app module dependencies initialized and auth module dependencies initialized, and we have our auth controller set up. So that's wonderful. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go into our auth controller. We're going to go ahead and set up two endpoints. We need one endpoint where the user can log in. So we need to set up a post request endpoint. So I'm going to use the post decorator, and that's going to be imported from the Nest.js common library. And I'm going to go ahead and name this endpoint login like that. Then I'm going to go ahead and just call the method login, and this method is going to need to take in an argument. It's going to need to take in the request body. So I'm going to use the @body decorator like that. And then the object itself is going to contain the username as well as the password. So I'm going to call the argument auth payload, I guess. You can call it whatever you want. And I'm going to go ahead and create a DTO, or also known as a data transfer object. And that just basically represents your request object or your response object that is being transferred from the client to the backend, or transported from the client to the backend. So I'm going to go and create a new folder, and I'm going to call this the DTO, and I'm going to create a new file. I'll call it auth.dto.ts. And then a DTO is basically just a class. You could use an interface, but it's recommended by the Nest.js developers, according to the documentation, to use a class. So I'm going to go ahead and call this class auth payload DTO. And then we need our two fields, username, which is going to be a string, and then a password, which is also going to be a string. And I'm going to go ahead now and annotate this auth payload with that auth payload DTO class that we just created. So now what we're going to do is go into our auth.service.ts file, and we're going to go ahead and set up a method called validateUser. And what this validate user method is going to do is it's going to take in that DTO, this auth payload DTO, as an argument. So let me pass it there and then annotate that. And we're of course going to call validate user from our controller class. Now validate user is going to need to check to see if the username, first of all, actually is a valid one by comparing it with the database. Right now we don't have a database set up, so I'm just going to go ahead and create some fake users right now. So const fake users equals, and then this array of users, and then we'll just set up a fake password right now. I'll just set up 2 users for now. And let's just do that. Okay. And now, of course, if you have a database, then what you would do instead of comparing it with this array or checking to see if it's in the array, you would query your database and look to see if the user is found by its username. So let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to actually just destructure the username and the password like this from the object, the auth payload DTO object. And then I'm first going to check to see if the user exists. So const find user equals, and we're going to reference our fake users array, and then use the find method, pass in our predicate function, which is going to take in this user object right over here. And we're going to go ahead and check to see if user.username is equal to username. And if find user is not found, we can just return false, or I'll return null instead. And then, of course, what we want to do additionally is if the user is found, let's compare the password. So if password is equal to find user.password. And at this point, what we can do is we can actually authenticate the user by creating a JSON Web Token and sending it back to the user. So currently we don't have the JSON Web Token library installed just yet, but let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go into my terminal right now, and I'm going to install a couple of dependencies. So I'm going to type npm I, and then the first dependency that I am going to install is @nestjs/jwt. And then we also will need passport. So I'm going to install that right now, might as well. So @nestjs/passport. And then we're also going to need the actual base passport package. We need passport JWT. And then we also need passport local as well. Okay, so we just need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 packages total. So I'm going to hit enter. So that way, right now I'm just installing all these packages so we don't have to go back and forth and do it later. So just might as well get that out of the way. And let's run our server again. And we want to configure our JWT module. So I'm going to go over here to auth.module.ts. And I'm going to go ahead and set up an imports array like this in the module options decorator, this object. And now what I'm going to do is, since we want to configure JSON Web Token, we're going to import the JWT module like this. And you can see that that gets imported from @nestjs/jwt. And then we're going to go ahead and call register on JWT module. And we're going to pass in some options. So the first prop I'm going to set is the secret. So of course, this is a value that is going to be used to actually encrypt the payload for generating that JSON Web Token. So I'm going to use a very random value right now, but for you, you obviously don't want to use something like this. You want an actual legitimate secret that's not guessable, that's not simple to figure out, like this one. And the other option that I'm going to set up is sign options. And I'm just going to set the expires in property. And this is where you can pass in a string, like kind of like this timestamp right over here, like on how long you want the JSON Web Token to live for. So right over here, I'm passing in 1H, which stands for 1 hour. And you can see that if you wanted, let's say 2 days, you would do 2D. If you wanted 1 minute, you would do 1M. If you wanted 1 second, you would do 1S, or 60 seconds, you would do 1M or 60S, just like that. We'll just do 1 hour for now, and then we'll leave all this alone. So now I'm going to show you how we can actually use the JSON Web Token service. So I'm going to go into my auth service right now, and I'm going to inject the JWT service. And inside my constructor, I'm going to say private JWT service. And then we're going to type annotate it with this JWT service class type right over here. And you can see that that gets imported also from the Nest.js JWT library. And so what I can do here is I can go ahead and reference the JWT service, and I can call, let me do that, this sign method right over here. And then what I can do is I can sign the payload. So what I want to do is I want to sign the username, the user object, but I obviously don't want to include the password as well. So what I'm going to do is I'll destructure the user like this. So I'm going to first destructure the password field away from the find user object. And I'm going to use the spreader operator to pack everything back into this user object right here. Okay, so you can see that when I hover over it, it actually shows me that this object has ID and username, but not password. That's because I'm grabbing the password out. So now what I can do is I can pass this user object into this sign method call as an argument. And what this will do is this will create a JSON Web Token, and it will also use our sign options and our secret setup right over here. I also want to make sure I return whatever this value returns back into the controller, and then the controller will return it to the client. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's go back to our controller, and let's inject our auth service in the constructor. So we'll do private auth service, auth service. So we're using the constructor to inject our auth service into our auth controller class, so that way we can actually reference it. So all I'm going to do is just return this .auth service .validate user auth payload, just like that. And now what we can do is we can go ahead and try to hit this endpoint. So let's go back to Thunder client, our HTTP client in VS Code. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a post request to localhost port 3000 /auth/login. Okay. I'm going to go into the request body and also send a username. Let's do Anson and then password. So I'm going to send an invalid one, and you'll see that right now it's going to be a 201. Let me just fix this real quick, actually. What I'm going to do is if the user is not found, then we'll just throw a new HTTP exception. Or actually, this should be handled in the controller layer, at least for now. Ideally, you could do this inside an interceptor if you wanted to, but I'm just going to do this in the controller. So let's do user. And this method does not return a promise. So what I'll do is this: if no user, throw new HTTP exception, and then let's just do invalid credentials, and then 401. Otherwise, we'll return the user. Okay, so I'm going to pass in an invalid username and password, and you can see right now it gives me a 401. Now I'm going to pass a valid password, and you can see that it gives me back this JSON Web Token. So what we can do now is we can actually copy this JSON Web Token, and on the client side, on let's say for example, if you're using React and you're making a request to this endpoint, you would have to handle taking this JSON Web Token and then storing it in local storage. And then whenever you want to use the JSON Web Token, you would just grab it from local storage and attach it in the request headers as a authorization header. So I'll show you how to do that later on. But we can see that at least our JSON Web Token service is in fact working just fine. And you can see that we have this string right over here. Okay. And what I can do additionally is I can also go over to an online JWT debugger. So let me just show you this real quick. Okay, so this is jwt.io. That's the website. And what I can do is I'm going to take this JSON Web Token. I'm going to paste it right over here. And you can see that we have our payload data, and it also has this IAT property called issued at. And I don't know if you can see this, but it's kind of really small, but you can see that it was issued at 3:26 or 3:32 a.m. at 36 seconds. And that's currently my time. And then it expires in 1 hour, so 4:36 a.m. So you can see that it is working just fine. So back in our code, we're going to look at the login method again. So this time what we're going to do is we're going to actually set up Passport because we already have the JSON Web Token working. We just need to configure it to work with Passport. And what this will do is when you successfully log in, Passport will take care of attaching a user object and it'll populate it with the user data itself on the request body. So for example, if I were to use the request decorator, and then let's type annotate with the request interface from Express. If I were to reference the request object right over here, you can see that right now it doesn't recognize this user type. That's because we haven't enabled Passport yet. So let's go back to our code. We want to go ahead and set up Passport.js now. So we're going to go into the auth.module.ts file, and I'm going to import Passport module and place that inside the imports array just like this. We're going to go ahead and create a new folder called strategies. And I'm going to create all of my Passport strategies. So remember how we installed Passport local, and then we also installed Passport JWT. So we installed two strategy packages that allow us to implement certain types of authentication methods in our system. So for example, Passport local is for username and password authentication. Passport JWT allows us to actually take care of validating the JWT before the request hits our endpoint. So it'll take care of checking to see if the JSON Web Token is valid by grabbing it from the authorization headers. And if it is invalid, either for whatever reason it is the wrong JWT or it expired, then it will actually handle that for us. It will throw back a 403, which is a forbidden status code. And that means that it'll reject the request, so we don't actually have to write any custom logic ourselves. So let's go ahead and first set up our local strategy. So I'm going to create a file called local.strategy.ts. And this strategy is actually pretty straightforward. We're going to create a class, call it local strategy. And then you're going to extend this Passport strategy. Now this is a function. Right over here, you can see that's a function. And we actually need to pass in this strategy class that I'm going to import from Passport local, just like that. Okay, so you're going to take this class and you're going to pass it in to this function over here. And it ends up returning a class itself. And so that's why you're able to extend whatever this function call returns. So now we're going to go ahead and set up our constructor. And then we're going to call the super classes constructor. And the other method that we're going to set up is the validate method. And so this validate method will actually take in a username and a password, just like this. And inside the validate method, we're actually going to invoke this validate user method that is in our auth service. So we actually need to also inject the auth service into our local strategy class. So let's do that real quick. And I also need to use the injectable decorator on my local strategy class because we want to add our local strategy as a provider. So let's go ahead and do that inside our auth.module.ts file. So right where you see providers, we currently only have auth service set up. Let's go ahead and add local strategy, just like that. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is inside validate. I'm going to go ahead and declare a variable called user. And I'm going to go ahead and just reference this .auth service .validate user. And I want to pass in the username and password. And now notice how right now I'm passing it as an object that has a username and password property, because this validate method actually gives you the username and password as two separate arguments. Okay, that's actually how the local strategy gives you these parameters. Okay, so that's why we need to wrap it in between these curly braces to pass as an object, because our validate user method in auth service takes in an object. So what we'll do is remember that validate user can return the user itself, or in this case, it returns a string, or it can actually return null, which means that the user was actually not found. So we need to handle that case accordingly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check to see if the user is not defined. Then I'm going to throw, whoops, can't type, throw a new unauthorized exception. So instead of using HTTP exception and passing in a message and a status code, I can just actually use unauthorized exception like this. Okay. And then you can see that the response status code will be a 401. Now, if the user is defined, we'll just return user like this. Now, I'm going to show you how we can actually invoke that strategy. It's actually not that difficult. In order for us to have this local strategies validate method get called, we need to go back to our login request method, and we need to use a guard. So I'm going to use this use guards decorator like this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and use this local guard. So Nest.js Passport actually has this built-in auth guard that you can use. Let me just import that real quick. And it comes from the Nest.js Passport library. And it's already set up for us by Nest.js Passport. So we really don't need to do anything except for just calling this. And then we want to pass in the strategy name. So in our case, we're using the local strategy, just like this. And I want to show you what happens now when I try to make a request to the login endpoint. So let's do that very quickly. I'm going to make a post request. And let me actually send an invalid password. So you'll notice that now it actually sends a 401 unauthorized. And you can actually see that the message is actually different than this right over here. So just to not confuse you all, what I'll do is I'm going to remove this line right over here. And I'll show you what happens. So if I send an invalid password, you can see that this error that is being returned back to us, that 401 unauthorized status code, it's actually coming from the strategies validate method right over here. Okay? It's coming from right over here. So we're actually using our guard to handle that authentication logic for us, and it invokes our strategy itself. Now, to go even further, normally you don't actually want to just pass in this guard like this, and the Nest.js docs don't recommend that because you're using just like these magic strings. So instead, what you could do is you can create a new folder, call it guards, and then we're going to create a new file, and I'll call this local.guard.ts. And what you can do is you can create a new class and call it local guard. And then you want to extend this auth guard and pass in local, just like that. And then let me also mark this class as an injectable. And then we want to implement this canActivate method. And this canActivate method takes in this context, this execution context argument, and it returns a Boolean. So in this situation, what we want to do is we want to just call super.canActivate. So we're going to pretty much call the superclass's canActivate method. So in this case, it would be the authGuard local, whatever this class returns, we're going to be calling that class's canActivate method, and we can just pass in the context like this. This ends up returning a Boolean. Let me just first replace this with the local guard now. And it's going to work the exact same way. So let's make a request. And if I send the valid password, it works. But what I want to also show you is that inside our local guards can activate method, I want to show you that this can activate method is being hit whenever I make a request. So you'll see that if I look in the console right now, it says hello world. So what's happening is whenever we make a post request, we're first using this local guard, and the local guard is going to invoke this can activate method. And you can see it says console log hello world. And so what happens is when we call super.canActivate, it's going to invoke our strategy's validate method. So right over here, I can also just console log inside local strategy, and then whatever the username and password is, it's going to be in this scope, in this validate method scope as well. And so let's make another request. So now you can see first it says hello world, and then it says inside local strategy. So that shows you the order that everything is happening in. And I think this is very important to understand. And the reason why I'm explaining it is because I don't want to just do this whole thing and not also help you understand what's going on. So if you needed to add additional logic during the authentication phase, during the login phase, then you would want to do it inside this can activate method. So that's the whole reason why I'm showing you this, is because I understand that some of you may want to add additional logic instead of just checking to see if the username and the password is valid. Okay, but ideally though, what really is the responsibility of this can activate method is returning a Boolean value. And this Boolean value again is going to be returned from this validate, or it's going to pretty much resolve into a Boolean because this validate method, remember, returns null or the actual user itself. And of course, if there is no user, then it won't do anything. And just very quickly, if I were to actually just remove this super.canActivate call and if I return false, you'll see that no matter what, it's going to always return a 403, even if I pass in a valid password or invalid password. So that just shows you that this can activate method inside the local guard is very important. So hopefully that makes sense. So let's go ahead and move on. So you can see that we do get our JSON web token back. So that's great. So now what I want to do is I want to implement the profile route. And this is going to be used to get the user's profile because we've already logged in successfully. We have our JSON web token. We now need to actually use that JSON web token and make authenticated API requests. So I'm going to go ahead and set up a GET request using our GET decorator that comes from an Nest.js common. And I'll call this status. And we're going to go ahead and just call this endpoint method status like this. And now what I can do is I can actually use the request decorator. So again, that is imported from Nest.js common right up top over here. And this gives you the actual request object. So let me type annotate it with the request interface. And by referencing the request object, there should be this user property, but for some reason it's actually not showing up. And I think it's because we actually forgot to install one of the types file. So I'm going to go ahead and do that very quickly. Let me go ahead and exit the program. And I'm going to type go ahead and type npm I at or -d at types passport JWT, because I don't think we have that right now. Let me double check. At types JWT. Yep, we're missing that. And then we also want to add the types for passport local, just like this. And then let's run our server again. So now we actually should be able to reference user. Yep, now you can see that with those type files, it actually overrides that request interface from Express, and you can see that we have the user property, and it says it could be undefined, which is true because the user could be logged in or they could not be logged in. And if the user is not logged in, then this user property is undefined, and that's how we're going to verify that the user is actually authenticated. So now in order to actually successfully implement our status endpoint, we need to set up our JSON Web Token strategy, and then we need to set up a JSON Web Token guard. So let's go into our strategies folder and create a new file. We'll call it jwt.strategy.ts. And I'm going to go ahead and create a class, and I'll call it JWT strategy. And then we're going to extend passport strategy. So remember the same thing that we did with our local strategy, but this time the strategy class that we're going to import is going to come from passport JWT, not passport local. So this is how passport strategy will know which strategy to actually use depending on the strategy class that you import from whichever strategy package. Okay, so by passing strategy right over here, we now are going to know that we're using the JWT strategy. So we need to implement the constructor, and then we need to call the superclasses constructor. Now, unlike our local strategy where we just called it the superclass constructor, we actually need to pass in arguments into our superclass constructor, or one object with some fields. And this is going to configure how the JSON Web Token strategy is going to work. So for example, one of the fields is JWT from request, and this basically will allow you to extract the JWT from wherever you think it's going to be. So right over here, I imported this extract JWT helper module, and I have a bunch of these methods right over here. So you can see that it says, okay, where should we grab the JWT from? From the auth header, from auth header as a bearer token, from auth header with scheme, from the body field. It's basically wherever you are going to include the JSON Web Token in. So typically people will send the JSON Web Token as an auth header as a bearer token. So we would want to use from auth header as bearer token. Sometimes people will send the JSON Web Token in the request body. So you would do from body field like this. And then you would want to specify what the field name is. So you can do something like access token like that. In our case, I'm going to show you how to do it from the auth header as a bearer token, which is pretty standard. And then what will happen is whenever we make a request and send our JSON Web Token, it's going to go ahead and look inside the headers, and it's going to look for the bearer token. And if it's not found, then it's going to, of course, reject the request. So the other property that we want to set up is ignore expiration. And what this field allows you to do is if you set it to true, it just pretty much ignores the expiration on the JSON Web Token. So this is useful if you want to do some additional validation on the JSON Web Token. But we're going to set this to false, so this will not ignore the expiration. So it will take that into consideration when verifying the JSON Web Token. Okay, so that way if the JSON Web Token is expired, then we don't have to worry about doing any checks at all. The JSON Web Token strategy will take care of it for us. The other thing that we need to set up is this secret or key, and we're going to have this match right over here. This secret right over here that we used to sign our payload, ABC123. Again, this has to be completely something that is secure, and you don't want it to be guessable. Okay? All right, so let's just go ahead and use the injectable decorator on our JWT strategy class. And now we can also implement this validate method on our JSON Web Token strategy class, the same way that we did it with our local strategy. So validate. And what this validate method will take in as arguments is it's going to take in this payload argument. And I'm just going to set the type annotation to any for now. And this payload is actually going to be the object of literally the payload that you signed. So for example, when we look at our authservice.ts file, you can see right over here, I am calling jwtservice.sign, and I'm passing in the user itself. So what will happen is once the JWT strategy successfully verifies the JSON Web Token, it's going to give us that encrypted value, this payload right over here, which is going to be an object. And that will contain our user So I'll actually just write a console log and I'll say inside JWT strategy validate. And then I'll console log the payload as well. And our payload is going to be the user or whatever that signed value was. And we're just going to return it just like that. Okay. So we're done with our JWT strategy. Let's go into our auth.module.ts and we want to import that and add it as a provider. So I'm going to do JWT strategy, just like that. We're going to import that from our strategies folder, and then we're going to pass it as a provider right down over here. So we're not quite done yet. We need to tell Nest.js that, hey, whenever we make requests, we need to actually use this JWT strategy, but we want to do that only for this status endpoint. So to do this, we need to set up a JWT guard. So let's go into our guards folder, create a new file, and let's call it jwt.guard.ts. And we're going to go ahead and export this class, and we'll call it JWT auth guard extends auth guard JWT. And then let's first mark this as an injectable. And let's implement the canActivate method. And again, it's going to look very similar to your local guard. And all we need to do is just return super.canActivate and pass in the context. And then I'm going to go ahead and just write a console log inside JWT auth guard canActivate. And again, if you needed to do additional logic inside your auth guard, you can. But right now we don't really need to because our strategy will take care of all of the verification for us. Okay, so let's go ahead and go use this auth guard. So inside my controller file, inside my auth controller class, for my status endpoint right over here, I'm going to go ahead and use the use guards decorator like this. And I'm just going to pass in JWT auth guard like that. And now, what I'm going to do additionally is let me console log inside auth controller status method. So I'll just do that for now. And let me also console log the request.user object. So we're not going to return anything just yet. So I want to show you now what happens when I try to visit this status endpoint. So I'm going to make a GET request right now to the status endpoint. So auth/status. And we're not passing in any JSON Web Token. You see how now it says 401 unauthorized? If I were to obviously remove this use guards decorator, it's going to give us a 200 OK. But watch this. I'm going to go ahead and show you my console. Nothing is currently being logged to the console right now because we haven't done anything yet. But I'm going to go ahead and click send. And now you can see that it says inside JWT auth guard canActivate. So you can clearly see that the auth guard is being invoked. And again, if I were to return true, manually, it's going to give us back a 200 OK. Because no matter what you return from this canActivate method, this will allow the request to go through either to the next guard if there is another guard, or it'll just end up calling this status request handler. But you can clearly see that the auth guard is being used correctly, and it's going to go ahead and call the superclass. The superclass's canActivate method. In our case, remember we're using JSON Web Token. So what this will do is it'll invoke our JWT strategy right over here. Okay, and you'll also notice that right now it actually doesn't even log anything right over here. It doesn't log inside JWT strategy validate. If I click send, see how it doesn't log that message to the console. It doesn't log inside JWT strategy validate. That's because we don't have a valid JSON Web Token that we're sending to the server. So because that happens, it doesn't end up calling this validate method at all because our strategy is trying to verify it. Nothing happens, so it's not going to call this validate method at all. It's only going to call it when we actually have a verified JSON Web Token. So what I'll do now is let's go ahead and grab a new JSON Web Token. Let's log in. You can see I have my JSON Web Token. And again, if I pass in invalid password, it gives us back a 401. So I just copied my JSON Web Token from the previous request. And what I'll do now is this. So again, make sure you get your JSON Web Token right over here. Copy that. You're going to make a GET request to auth/status and whatever client you're using. So right now I'm using Thunder Client. If you're using Postman, you want to go to the headers. If you're trying to call the endpoint from, let's say, front end, let's say React or Angular, and you're using something like Axios or Fetch, then you want to make sure you configure the headers whenever you make your request. Okay, so you're going to go over here and you're going to type authorization. And then you want to go ahead and add bearer and then the JSON Web Token itself. So you're going to paste it like that. You're going to paste it like that. So bearer and then the token itself. Bearer space token. So hopefully that makes sense. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and click send. And now you see how we get a 200 OK. And if you look at the logs right now, you can see that first it logs inside JWT auth guard can activate. So it goes to the guard. Then it invokes our JWT strategy. So it says, hey, take this JSON Web Token from the header as a bearer token. Okay. We verify it. Everything works fine. Since everything was verified correctly, we call this validate method inside our JWT strategy class. And you can see that it says inside JWT strategy validate. And we can see our JSON Web Token right over here. And of course, if you wanted to do any additional validation after the payload has been verified, and now you have the actual original payload that was signed, then you can do that inside this validate method inside your JWT strategy class. So hopefully all of this makes sense, and hopefully you better understand now how to use it. Let me actually go ahead and return rec.user. So that way when I make a GET request, I can get that original user back. One thing that I do want to modify before I give a quick recap on everything that's going on. Earlier, when we were first implementing our login endpoint, before we even used Passport, we did actually manually call this validate user method inside the login method. We don't need to do this anymore because our local strategy already does this for us. So doing this is actually redundant. In this case, it's actually calling validate user twice. So it generates 2 JSON Web Tokens, and we don't actually want that. So we're going to go ahead and remove this line over here. We're going to remove this return user. We're going to remove this argument over here. But what we do want to return inside this login method is we want to actually return the JSON Web Token, because if we try to make a post request right now, it's not going to give us the JSON Web Token. So we can easily get the JSON Web Token thanks to the fact that we're using Passport.js. Remember, Passport will attach a dynamic user property to the request object itself. So whatever it is that you return from this validate method, so since we're returning the JSON Web Token, that JSON Web Token is going to be attached onto the request.user object. So if I use the request decorator, and then if I just return rec.user like this, it's going to go ahead and give me back that JSON Web Token as a response. Okay, and notice how if I were to go into my local strategy, if I just modified this to some random string, and now if I click send, make a post request to that login endpoint, you see how it sends me back ABC123 because I am modifying the return value inside the local strategy's validate method. Okay, so that's how we can actually send back the JSON Web Token. This is the proper way to do it. So just wanted to mention this quick fix for all of you. So now that we log in, what happens is we get our JSON Web Token, right? So this is our JSON Web Token. Now, when we want to make protected API calls, in this case, we have one endpoint that is protected. It uses the JWT auth guard. Okay, so any endpoint that you want to protect, that you want to require a valid JSON Web Token, you're just going to go ahead and apply this JWT auth guard using the use guards decorator on any of your request methods. So whenever I make a GET request to the status endpoint, I must provide my JSON Web Token in the authorization headers. Okay. So then what happens is this JWT auth guard gets invoked, and this itself will actually invoke the JWT strategy. Okay. So you can see right over here, when it calls can activate, it will call super.canActivate, which will invoke the JWT strategy. Okay, we have our options already set up over here. So we extract that JSON Web Token from the headers itself, from the auth headers, and then we ignore expired JSON Web Tokens. So if the JSON Web Token is valid, then what will happen is the JSON Web Token library will take care of decoding that JWT, and it will give us the payload right over here, which will be whatever it was that we passed in when we called .sign. So remember how earlier we called JWT service .sign and we passed in the user payload. So that's what this payload right over here will end up being. So let's just test this out again. I'm going to go ahead and take this JSON Web Token. I'm going to make a GET request to auth/status. See, right now it says unauthorized because I don't have my JSON Web Token. But let's pass it. So authorization, and then bearer, space, and then paste your token. And now you can see that this is the payload. If I were to look at the logs again, you can see right over here, inside JWT strategy validate. So that's this method right over here. And you can see the payload is just going to have the same user object that we passed into the sign method, but it includes these two additional properties as well. Okay. And again, like I said, any other API endpoints that you want to protect with a valid JSON Web Token, you just apply the use guards JWT auth guard to that endpoint method. So I hope this all made sense. I just wanted to give you all a quick recap. I encourage you to expand upon this and connect to a database. It's very easy. If you've seen some of my other videos where I show you how to connect to a database, either MongoDB or MySQL, then you should know how to do that. But the idea is the same thing. So over here in your auth service validate user method, instead of searching for the user in the array, you would search for the user inside your database. So you would use something like Prisma or TypeORM, and you would query the database for the user, check to see if the user is found. If the user is not found, return null or throw an HTTP exception. Check the passwords if the user is in fact found. If the passwords match, that's great. If they don't match, we actually should return or throw an error here if the passwords don't match, but I'll let you all take care of that. So if the passwords match, this is where you will generate that JSON Web Token. So that's going to be pretty much it for this video. If you like this video, please leave a like down below. It helps out a lot. If you have any questions, please ask them down below in the comments section. And if you need additional help with Nest.js or programming in general, I have a Discord server where you can join. The link is in the description. And I'll also leave a link to the GitHub repository for all the code that you're seeing in this video so you all can use it as a reference. So that's going to be pretty much it for this video. I'll see you all in my next episode. Peace out.